Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the University of Notre Dame. Delighted to have you here this morning. I'm Ray Offenheiser. I'm the Director of the Initiative for Global Development within the Keough School of Global Affairs here at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm one of your hosts and one of the organizers for the conference over the next 2 days. Delighted to welcome you all to the University of Notre Dame and to our conference of the future of work and workers. We have a great program of speakers for you and panelists who are going to bring a wealth of knowledge to this subject matter over the next couple of days. I'm sure you're going to find it a very stimulating event, and just want, for those of you who actually are active on social media, want to alert you to one thing. If you look immediately to your right, there is a social media hashtag there for you, for those of you who are active Twitterers, and we'd encourage you to tweet. So please use the hashtag if you're so inclined. To help us get started this morning, I've asked the University of Notre Dame Provost Tom Barish to make a few welcoming remarks. As Provost, Tom is charged with advancing the university's academic mission and its reputation for all of its colleges, schools, and institutes. A graduate of the University of Notre Dame, Tom has enjoyed a distinguished career both as a clinical psychologist and also as an academic administrator and leader. Before returning to Notre Dame as provost in 2005, Tom served as provost at Vanderbilt University for nearly 20 years, and then as president of Washington and Lee University. Since his return to Notre Dame, Tom has been a driving force behind a number of important academic initiatives and investments to strengthen Notre Dame's faculty, its research, its innovation, and its entrepreneurship programs. And he's also worked tirelessly not only to make Notre Dame a more international and global university, but also to strengthen our ties with local community and business leaders here in South Bend. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to Notre Dame Provost Tom Barish.
Thank you, Ray, and thank all of you for joining us this morning. On behalf of our president, Father John Jenkins, and the entire Notre Dame community, it's my pleasure to welcome you to campus and welcome you to this conference. It's great to see so many individuals come out on a rainy spring morning. I'd like to begin by thanking those who have helped sponsor this conference and make it possible for us. First is the City Foundation, whose global efforts for economic progress all around the world have helped many people improve the state of their lives. Second is the City of South Bend, the home for the University of Notre Dame. You had a greeting from our mayor last evening. It's a vibrant city, a progressive city, a city that's addressing a lot of the very issues which you will discuss over the next couple days. Third is Bob and Fran Zielsdorf family. They made a large grant, a gift to the Institute for Global Development that's helping put on this conference. Their generosity paid for a lot of the things that you will enjoy over the next couple days. And finally, I'd like to thank Ray and his colleagues and all the people at Notre Dame, from dining to the people who have put on the meeting, all the many details that entailed in a conference to make it successful. Would you join me in thanking these individuals and others who have helped put on this conference? The purpose of this conference is to discuss how best to prepare for the transformative changes that will take place in business and industry, in society in general, that are being driven by technology such as artificial intelligence and robotics and machine learning and so forth. These changes represent what the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. To be sure, technology will greatly advance fields ranging from the humanities to medicine, to industry, to science, to transportation, to manufacturing in small and large companies. That's the good news. The bad news, or at least the challenging news, is that workers in many of these fields, in transportation and manufacturing and other sectors, will see their jobs disrupted, as jobs that used to be performed by humans either will be performed by automation or will be eliminated. The result of this is what some call a great paradox that has already begun. On the one hand, more and more jobs will be created and open, and at the same time, more and more people will be unemployed. The challenge, of course, is to help the people who are unemployed gain the skills so that they can win the jobs that will be open. Now, everyone doesn't agree with this prediction of this paradox. It's not a new insight. And we will hear people today, experts today and tomorrow, who have studied this situation, give us their best prediction of how it will unfold and what steps we can take to address it. New ideas about how we can address these challenges in whatever sector you might work in. Let me conclude with 3 questions to consider. Why here? Why us? And why now? First, why here? Why in the Midwest? Why should we be concerned about technologies like robotics and machine learning, which are largely being developed in Boston or Silicon Valley on the coast? The answer is that our economy and workforce in the Midwest is disproportionately based on manufacturing. To give you a local example, the South Bend Elkhart region, the region that we're living in here, has 3 to 5 times the percentage of jobs in manufacturing as the national average. And we've been identified as the 3rd most vulnerable community to losing jobs as a result of automation. This is an example of the entire challenge the Midwest is facing. We want to be part of the discussions. We want to be part of finding the solutions for the lack of jobs that will occur in many sectors because of automation. They may be developing technologies on the coast, but it will disproportionately affect people in the Midwest. The second question, why us? Why have this at Notre Dame? Why is a private Catholic research university concerned about the impacts of advanced technology in regional manufacturing? The answer to this question is perhaps a little less intuitive and in some ways complicated. No university can be a great university if the community in which it lives isn't thriving. The future of Notre Dame is inextricably linked to the future of South Bend, to the schools, to safety, to employment for our spouses of the people who Notre Dame employs. If we don't have a community that thrives in this way, in these ways, then people aren't going to want to come to this university, and the university won't do well. As the largest employer in this area, we're interested in and we have the responsibility to help shape the future of this community, its vibrancy, its ecosystem, its success. We want, as our mission says at the university, to be a force for good in the world, but that world starts with our own backyard. We want to be a force for good in this community. That is, why us? Why now? Because this is urgent. This is already happening. We can't afford to wait. And if we don't get involved at this time, we may lose the opportunity to become involved in trying to deal with the effects of automation on manufacturing, on workers, and the future of work. We don't have time to wait. To quote the Canadian author and futurist William Gibson, who coined the term cyberspace in the 1980s, quote, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed," close quote. So we need this sense of urgency to make sure that we do everything we can to address the issues that are already beginning to occur. Thank you again for joining us for this conference. I'm confident that we'll learn a lot from the speakers and the panels, and I'm confident that learning what we can do about the future will help us not only weather the changes that are going to occur, but lead them and benefit from them as well. Thank you very much.
So now I want to take a moment to introduce and greet our Tia Hodges, who is from Citigroup Foundation and one of our principal sponsors for this event. Tia Hodges is a senior program officer at the Citi Foundation and leads strategy and investments for the Youth Economic Opportunity Portfolio within Citi Foundation, including Pathways to Progress initiative here in the United States. She's responsible for designing and managing grant relationships, and working closely with community partners to structure grant programs that focus on helping young people link education, workforce goals with leadership training, professional networks, and on-ramps to employment. And she wanted me to underline for you, she's a Midwest girl from Milwaukee, another city that's undergone many of the kinds of transitions we've seen here in South Bend and may face many of the same kind of challenges. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Tia up.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. The future awaits us. Can't wait for today's conversation, and I'm very happy, excited, proud to be back in the Midwest. It's always a good feeling to be back home. Thank you to Ray for that wonderful introduction. Provost Burish, esteemed colleagues and friends, I'm delighted to be here with all of you today on the campus of the University of Notre Dame on behalf of the City Foundation, and to take part in what promises to be a really exciting, interesting, and dynamic conversation on the future of work. The City Foundation is proud to support the Future of Work convening in partnership with University of Notre Dame and the City of South Bend. But first, I'd like to take a moment to thank a few people who have been so important to the planning and execution process. A really special thank you to Ray, to Melissa Paulson, Shaheen Goldrick, Ty Lavers, Ed Jerkovic, and many others across campus who have spent so many hours, so many monthly calls with me, and have really dedicated themselves to putting together and constructing what is really an outstanding schedule of events and speakers. So once again, please do give them a round of applause. A 2016 report from the World Economic Forum noted that 65% of young people entering primary school today will end up in jobs that do not currently exist. So our gathering here in South Bend is no accident. Clearly we're here at the University of Notre Dame, but it is by means no accident. It is the perfect place to explore what AI, robotics, manufacturing, freelance, and the sharing economy means for the future of work, and the incredible innovations and solutions that municipal leaders, which you'll hear from shortly, academia, private and nonprofit sectors are leading to ensure that our collective workforce successfully engages and is competitive in the future of work. At the City Foundation, our mission is to promote economic progress and improve the lives of people in low-income communities across the globe. It's the work we do every day. We invest in efforts that increase financial inclusion, catalyze job opportunities for youth and adults alike, and reimagine approaches to building economically vibrant cities. So why am I here, or why is City Foundation supporting the event today? I'll give you a little bit of background on some of our work and investment in youth in particular. In 2014, the City Foundation launched Pathways to Progress and invested $50 million in the US in 100,000 young people from low to moderate income communities to help them acquire 21st century skills and access employment opportunities in the communities in which they resided. In 2017, we doubled down on our efforts, and we are in year 3 of this commitment with a $100 million commitment and expanded Pathways to Progress globally to reach 500,000 youth around the world and leverage the time and talents of 10,000 city volunteers to mentor and coach young people. Now I'm going to take a pause there because that's a lot of investment. It's the largest commitment the foundation has ever made, and it's a BHAG, big, hairy, audacious goal, but one that we found really significant and important. We understood then, as we do today, that our young people are our greatest asset, and adults alike. We're all adults here, so we're equally an asset as well. And that is why the Future of Work convening is so important to not only our work, but your work and our work collectively. While unemployment is historically low for many or most communities in the US, Many young people still struggle today to gain a foothold in today's job market. Based on research that the City Foundation commissioned from Ipsos, we learned that young people are optimistic, they want to participate in the workforce, and they can see a future for themselves. Yet they find themselves without the necessary job skills to compete for these new jobs. Some would call that a skills mismatch. They have one particular set of skills not equal enough to the skills that they need to compete for today's jobs, or for jobs in the future that are very much unknown. And importantly, they also lack a network to help them secure meaningful and viable employment to achieve their professional dreams and also ascend the socioeconomic ladder. In closing, the future of work still seems largely undefined. This is just Tia saying this, so you can agree to disagree, but I still find it to be largely undefined. And it is certainly uncertain, and yet it presents a call to action to light a pathway in what can feel like a level of uncertainty. So all of us here collectively, in addition to taking in the information, we have an opportunity and a responsibility to identify solutions and take those back to our communities. If we are all to be successful and live in thriving cities and towns, just like South Bend, Indiana, we must begin to answer what is the future of work and provide a pathway that we can collectively engage to inform, educate, and prepare young people and adults alike to not only participate, but to thrive in the fourth industrial revolution. Thank you again to the University of Notre Dame, the City of South Bend, for your partnership on this convening. My hope for all of you here today is that you will take in the full breadth, which I'm sure you will, but that you will take in the full breadth of the experts and conversations over the next day and a half, and leave with solutions and opportunities in hand to move this work forward. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Tia, for those excellent opening comments. I want to take actually just a moment actually to recognize and thank Tia. She's thanked all of us, but we want to return the gratitude to Tia and all of her colleagues at the City Foundation for their generous support of this event. The City Foundation, as I think you just heard, is a philanthropic leader globally, not just nationally, in promoting youth employment and workforce training. Through literally hundreds of partnerships with organizations like the United Way and Junior Achievement and many other organizations actually in many of the countries that they work in all around the world, they're reaching millions of young men and women in countries and communities in nations from Africa to Asia through Latin America. From the very earliest days of our conversations with Tia about the possibility of supporting this conference, it was clear that the City Foundation saw the strategic importance of addressing these issues, not only at home here in the United States, but globally as well. Working with all these young people, they can see firsthand the need for new kinds of training, reskilling, and so forth. Tia has been a great collaborator throughout this process in suggesting topics, panelists, and perspectives. So on behalf of the organizing team here at Notre Dame, I want to publicly acknowledge the close working partnership we've enjoyed with Tia and her team at the City Foundation throughout the entire planning process. So thank you very much, Tia, for all that you've done for us. So the planning for this conference started over, as many things do in this world, over a cup of coffee or cups of coffee in a coffee shop downtown in South Bend that brought together a small team of those of us from the Initiative for Global Development here at the university, as well as colleagues from the office of the mayor, to talk about this issue and decide what is it we might be able to do together. Within the Keough School of Global Affairs, we had recognized that the tremendous impact that the digital revolution will have on the lives as well as livelihoods of societies, and on lives and livelihoods as well as societies and politics over the course of the 21st century. We'd already made it a priority to initiate work on this issue when we learned of the leadership role that the Mayor Buttigieg, or Mayor Pete as we call him here in South Bend, was playing as the chairman of the task force on automation for the National Conference of Mayors. We also learned of the mayor and city's role as a founding member of MetroLab, a national coalition of some 46 cities that are committed to using big data and artificial intelligence to deliver improved and more efficient services to their citizens. Inspired by the innovative Metro 2020 partnership between Carnegie Mellon University and the city of Pittsburgh, the Obama administration took up the idea and encouraged other cities to launch similar dynamic partnerships and innovation in their cities so that they might learn from one another and take advantage of the presence of universities as anchor institutions in their cities for this kind of partnership. The MetroLab Coalition continues to thrive and to model what cities might achieve through dynamic and creative partnerships with their local universities. Meanwhile, universities are learning a great deal about the problems of managing large and complex urban landscapes and how artificial intelligence and automation might be deployed effectively within their cities to deliver better quality of life and services for their citizens. This conversation over coffee is what prompted our meeting and the partnership between the Keough School of Global Affairs and the City of South Bend in developing the ideas for this conference. Like many cities here in the Midwest and across our nation, here in South Bend, we have lived firsthand the impacts of factory closures and massive job losses on the lives and livelihoods of our citizens. Over the last decade, the University of Notre Dame has worked closely with the city and regional development authorities to attract investment, to revitalize neighborhoods, and to promote entrepreneurship. There is, of course, much left to do, but I think the important thing to underline is there's a new dynamism and confidence in South Bend that has emerged in response to such efforts at collaboration, efforts at innovation. And those have been inspiring, I think, to discover for us similar kinds of experiences emerging in other large and small cities across the nation. And you'll be hearing a little bit about that from some of our panelists in a moment. For our first panel for this conference, we're fortunate to have with us representatives from cities where there is visionary leadership and dynamic partnerships between city government, local universities, and the private sector, all seeking to find scalable solutions to today's most intractable problems. It may be, as it is with the case with climate change, that the real change we need to see within our cities here in the United States to prepare communities and working families for the digital age will be driven by subnational leadership, not necessarily national leadership, leadership at the state and local level. And I think our panelists for this first panel are a good example of what that kind of leadership looks like, and you'll learn a lot about the kinds of things and the kind of dynamism and energy that they're generating within their cities and communities. And I think they're a good demonstration of that leadership potential. So again, thank you all for being here. We're excited with the program we have prepared for you and hope that you are stimulated by the discussions over the next 2 days. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Cooper Martin, who will introduce our panel. And briefly, I want to introduce Cooper to all of you. From research into how the latest mobility and technology trends will impact life and leadership in cities to advancing meaningful public policy, Cooper and the National League of Cities Center for Solutions are invested in making American cities work better. Cooper is the Director of Sustainability Solutions at the National League of Cities. He is an expert in sustainable urban policy and has more than 10 years' experience working with local, state, and federal government agencies on topics such as climate resilience, transportation, water management, energy, community development, and disaster mitigation. In addition, he works with mayors, council members, and other local leaders throughout the United States to catalyze support and celebrate city-led sustainability efforts. Prior to joining the National League of Cities, Cooper held multiple positions in government and community relations at the American Institute of Architects, as well as with the Kansas House of Representatives. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science and international studies from the University of Kansas and a master's degree in public policy from American University. I personally can think of no better moderator to help us kick off this discussion this morning with our panelists. So Cooper, from there I'll turn it over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. It's good to be here, and I'm excited to be able to moderate this panel and really dig into some of the issues here that that has been laid out already by our speakers, so I won't delay too long. Other than to just say that the future of work was the top research priority at the National League of Cities in 2018. At the time, led by Mayor Mark Stodola, the mayor of Little Rock, Arkansas. He was the one who spearheaded that charge, and so these topics of automation, innovation, the coming digital age, everything that's affecting labor is something that is impacting cities all over the country. Our current president is Mayor Karen Freeman Wilson in the city of Gary, Indiana. So some of the struggles that her community has been facing are definitely struggles that people from this region understand well. And our incoming president next year will be Councilman Joe Buscaino, who is the councilman of the city of Los Angeles. His district includes the Port of Los Angeles, which is a major employer. He comes from a port family, and that's an institution that is rapidly automating a lot of its own functions. So you can imagine how personal some of these issues are to the leaders in cities around the country. And that's really why the National League of Cities is excited to take on this challenge, to help local governments lead through these changes. Because we talk about a lot of these issues in big terms, in national terms, with the statistics that are so, I think, difficult to comprehend. And as it's already been pointed out, all of these changes are happening very unevenly. The city here has suffered from very different impacts and effects of closures than the city of Little Rock and the city of Los Angeles. So it's up to these local leaders, and it's up to institutions who partner with local leaders to really figure out what this means at a local level, to figure out what this means at a regional level, and how to prepare their workforces and their citizens for what's coming and the challenges that face them. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, and they'll join me here on stage and we can get into it. First up, we have Mayor Christopher Cabaldon, who is the mayor of West Sacramento, California. He's been the mayor since 2004 there. He's the chair of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Committee on Jobs, Education, and Workforce. He's also the former chair of the Sacramento Area Council of Governments' groundbreaking Blueprint for the Future project, how urban development impacts the labor market, as well as the region's Partnership for Prosperity. Prior to serving as mayor, Mr. Cabaldon was the vice chancellor of the California Community Colleges system from 1997 to 2003. So he knows a few things about developing workforce for a region. Next, we will have Mayor John Cranley, mayor of Cincinnati, Ohio, who's been a longtime public servant. He's been mayor of Cincinnati since 2013. Prior to that, he served on the city council from the year 2000 to 2009. And Mayor Cranley created the city's first Office of Economic Inclusion and Minority Contracting, which in its first year of operation increased spending with minority-owned businesses from $4 million to $11 million. This is helping the city contract with local minority-owned businesses, and I'm sure he'll talk a little bit more about that. Additionally, Cincinnati's been recognized as one of the nation's most immigrant-friendly cities, and something that really is difficult to integrate immigrant communities into the workforce. So that's something that we'll probably get into a little bit on the panel here. Next up, we have Santi Garces, who joined the city of Pittsburgh in January of 2019, but I understand he's got some friends here. Prior to being in the city of Pittsburgh, he was the chief innovation officer here in the city of South Bend, helping to stand up that office with Mayor Pete Buttigieg. In his first year of, so what he's doing in Pittsburgh during the time here, he helped improve efficiency and effectiveness of municipal services by developing municipal talent, optimizing processes, and designing its technology solutions. Next up, we have Ben Levine, who is the executive director of the MetroLab Network. We've already heard a little bit about MetroLab and its start in Pittsburgh, as well as the partnership that the city of South Bend and Notre Dame have through MetroLab programs. Having initially served as the interim director of the organization following the launch of MetroLab. Prior to being with MetroLab, Ben served as the policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Treasury, working on state and local government finance, as well as infrastructure policy. He worked closely with the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy and the organization and launch of the MetroLab Network. And finally, I do see that we've got Mayor Pete here, so I'll go ahead and provide his introduction. He's been mayor of South Bend since 2012. He did take a leave of absence during that to serve a term on a tour in Afghanistan during a 7-month deployment in 2014, earning a commendation medal for his counterterrorism work. He's also the chair of a U.S. Conference of Mayors Committee, with this one on automation. and he was called the most interesting mayor you've never heard of by the Washington Post, which I understand he took pretty personally. With that, we're going to get into the panel a little bit. Each of the speakers is going to go in turn and provide just a little bit of a context for what their community, what their organization is doing. We'll get into a little bit of Q&A, and I know that there'll be questions from the audience before we're done. So with that, I'm going to go in order that everyone was introduced, and so we'll start with Mayor Cabaldon from the city of West Sacramento. Mayor.
Great, thanks so much, Cooper, and I'm really excited to be here. This is a critical topic, even in California. We're not the Silicon Valley in West Sacramento, but pretty close. And this is a topic that for mayors is one that we're largely in by choice. My constituents are mostly not evaluating me on my approaches to solving the future of work as a challenge, as compared to, well, we don't have snow, so I don't have to worry about the plowing, but as compared to whether the police union is happy or whether the water is clean or the toilet flushes. It's not in the 5 performance metrics that are up in the election. I've never been challenged since I was elected in 1998 the first time. I've never been challenged based on my either my policies or my lack of policies around future of work. So this has not been a domain that mayors have largely been involved in for years, and that's changing rapidly now. And I think in part because mayors are one of the few unicorns in the political system that see a whole community for what it is and what the challenges and the aspirations are across the silos of environmental quality and social justice and economic development. All the pieces, they necessarily come together in a place in ways that they don't come together in a House committee, for example, or in a State Department. So you really can't run away from the most trenchant problems or challenges that you have in a community when you're the mayor, because they appear all over the place, and all the connectedness between those challenges emerges pretty quickly. So what you're seeing now across the country are mayors that are diving in this in completely unique ways. And I think this is one of the great contributions that mayors have to make in this space, because we don't have, our professional association doesn't have a 200-page guidebook or accreditation standard for how you deal with issues of the future of work or the present of work in our communities. We're largely unconstrained in the approaches that we take. And so you are seeing across the country a lot of different ways in which mayors are engaged. The other thing is just procedurally about how mayors work. Because we're often seen as little governors or little presidents in some ways, and we are, but a lot of our work is opportunistic. I don't get up in the morning and say, what are the top 10 most important problems in my community today? Let me just go through them one at a time. I get up in the morning and I have to deal with, this is the day that the garbage contract expires and I got to pick a new one. This is the day somebody wants to rezone the piece of property at Broadway in Maine, so I got to deal with that. So it's mostly having a framework for dealing with the opportunism that arises from each individual decision that gets put in front of you, as opposed to, here are my 16 initiatives that are now going to drive that. So that forces mayors to operate in different contexts and to look at opportunities that you might not otherwise. What's the role of zoning in the future of work? Well, I didn't have to think about that last week, but since I'm thinking about the future of work and somebody wants to rezone a piece of property away from industrial and towards business park, what does that really mean in terms of the workforce that we're creating next? So just context. Now, what you are seeing just down the road from me, for example, in Stockton, California, is where probably the most prominent of the universal basic income experiments is being undertaken by Mayor Tubbs. That city's about a half an hour away from West Sacramento, and that's a very bold approach to try to deal with the future of work in the context of income support. And we're not doing it in my city. I've got, like most everyone else in the world, including I think Mayor Tubbs, I've got a lot of questions about how this is all going to go. But I think it's exactly right for a mayor in the country to be leading this evaluation in a place exactly like Stockton. In my own city, and similar work happening in Oakland and Los Angeles and other places around the country, we are big in the cradle to career space. So the West Sacramento home run that we've created in our city, with the support of a voter-approved sales tax, provides universal high-quality preschool, college savings account for every single child, guaranteed paid internship in high school, a system of digital badges to signal and account for learning outside of the classroom, free community college, plus scholarships for universities that are based on those digital badges. And they are intended to create a more resilient workforce and a set of opportunities and a set of dispositions toward creativity and learning among our population, more so than just generate more college degrees for themselves, but really change the equation around how people grow up in our city around how to learn. Now, none of that was my job, 5 days ago. There was the school district and the county health clinic and some other people. None of that was a city responsibility. But most of that was nobody's responsibility. Nobody was in charge of preschool. Nobody was in charge of learning outside of the classroom. And so that created an opportunity for me not to be able to assemble all the other pieces that support learning, but that didn't have a sponsor and did not have 2 centuries of rules and expectations and norms about how they're supposed to operate. So that's the core of our strategy in the city, is trying to create this resiliency towards the future. I will say just one last thing, and that is that I often wonder whether in a couple of years I will get challenged by somebody who said, "Why was the mayor working so hard to preserve work?" Why would that be? Who was the mayor back when we created agriculture and then we didn't have to hunt so much? Who was the mayor back then that said, "No, we're good. We have to figure out how to." Our sense of dignity and purpose is wrapped up in hunting. If we no longer have that, then who are we as a people? So we still got to work on the challenges, but I do think it is important to unpack what do we really mean about work that we want to be anxious about, or that we need to be anxious about. What are we trying to protect? And maybe decomposing that in a way that allows for some more direct approaches to dignity, to meaning, to belonging, and some of the things that I know my colleague, the Automation Task Force, has been talking a lot about. So I think the cities are where a lot of this is happening. There are very few places where you will see massive $200 billion programs by any particular mayor who has got the answer that they're testing. But the laboratory is definitely at work in terms of creating some potential here.
Mayor Cranley?
Thanks for having me. I'm John Cranley, Mayor of Cincinnati. Cincinnati's, I think, a lot like South Bend, part of the Midwest. Suffered 60 years worth of deindustrialization, capital flight, loss of manufacturing hub. So I think there's a lot of commonalities here. It's great to be with my friend Mayor Pete, welcoming us to his great city. And I told him I went on a beautiful river walk last night. It's gorgeous downtown. I always say I think there are 4 big moves that are essential to creating growth and job opportunities. First, you've got to have, and this is, I think, counterintuitive for a lot of people like me who are kind of business-oriented, the social contract must be in decent shape. That is a predicate to economic growth. I think there's a lot of ideas that if you have economic growth, then you can try to make sure it's more just and more evenly distributed, which is a worthy and noble ambition, and certainly one I share. But what we found in my city is that we had not only capital flight out of our city for 50 years, but we had deep-seated racial tensions that boiled over into, after a police shooting of an unarmed black teen, into racial riots in 2001. Which was sort of the beginning of our modern era in Cincinnati, sadly and tragically. And we had to bring in the Justice Department, which I was a member of City Council at the time, and negotiate a change in culture to our social contract between the police and the community. And it's not perfect, but we've made real progress, which was really hard and took about 6 years before it really started to change. 6 years. The judge in New York who shot down stop and frisk cited the Cincinnati Collaborative Agreement, which is what we call it, as the role model for constitutional policing rather than stop and frisk. And I suggest, if you've been to Cincinnati recently, we have seen a tremendous renaissance. We're booming, we're growing again. We're one of only 2 cities in Ohio that's growing when the rest of state continues to decline. But I would say that repairing that social contract was a necessary first step. The second big move is public-private partnerships. I often say the only power of a mayor is to get his or her phone call returned. That's the only real power, besides, hiring water and garbage contracts and things like that. And so the power to convene is huge. And, at a local level, we can't command or regulate the private sector. We can't pass a minimum wage law, for example, that governs the employers in our city. But we can bring people together. And after we went through this racial unrest in 2001, we convened a public-private partnership that I think is spectacular. It's been written up many times, called 3CDC, which is a development corporation. And the business community has invested $10 in our city to every $1 in public dollar. Humongous leverage, which has transformed our downtown, our over the Rhine, our park spaces, our green spaces, and have created an environment that people want to be in again. 18 years ago, when we were going through those difficult times, everyone I knew in Cincinnati said, how do I get out? Now, everywhere I go in our region, and we're just a small part of a 2 million person region, they say, how do I get in? There's a real excitement around new urbanism that is creating opportunities and spaces for people who want to start businesses and be part of a more diverse culture. The third big move that we're engaged in, which was mentioned in the opening here by our first speaker this morning, is really harnessing the power of research institutions to commercialize business opportunities. All the research shows that the cities that are making the biggest comebacks, or the ones that are growing the most exponentially, regardless of comeback like we are in the Midwest, are those cities that are co-located with major research institutions in that city. Luckily, we have University of Cincinnati, we have Xavier and others, but UC is our big one. And we are creating an entire innovation district, research and development, and they're adopting very liberal policies and allowing businesses to access students' research to encourage the formation and start of businesses in Cincinnati. And then I want to end, the fourth big move is where I started, which is that it is also the case that while some measure of social justice is a predicate, it's also a measure of whether all the work you're doing is worthy in and of itself. And so in addition to police issues, we've invested millions into minority business incubation, venture capital, women-owned business incubation and capital. We've adopted immigrant-friendly policies. It was mentioned we've more than quadrupled the number of minority businesses that the city contracts with since I took office. And we have the same public-private partnership that revitalized the urban streetscape and city downtown experience is now come together to set a bold goal of beating the national average in poverty reduction, expansion of opportunity, and we're raising private funds to give emergency assistance relief, incubation, and coaching, job coaching to the most vulnerable employees who are getting into their first job. So those are the four big moves that we work on every day.
Great. And Santi, as a city staffer working behind these elected officials, how do you measure and implement some of the programs and things in both the city of South Bend, city of Pittsburgh? How have your experience been implementing some of these things and tracking all that?
Yeah, I think that it's great to find myself amongst such great mayors. And I think that this is the first panel that I've ever been with my former boss, Mayor Pete. So this is very exciting. I think when we consider that about 16.7% of people in the US work for government, and that the bulk of the jobs that government provide are really stable jobs, they're jobs that tend to sustain during economic downturns. And a lot of the jobs that we have in the city tend to be blue-collar jobs where you're out doing physical labor or you're doing clerical work. It's particularly challenging when we think about the future of work. Both in Pittsburgh and in South Bend, I was responsible for thinking about how do we use city funds most efficiently. And I said that we create, performance gains using technology or using process improvement. And the reality is that for cities and for most government, usually when you invest in those systems, that in the private sector usually would also lead to higher revenue. In government, you don't get more revenue when you do things more efficiently. So the way that you cash in the return at some point is you just need to use less people. And that presents a really difficult environment to think about automation and think about process improvement, because people are smart, and they know that when they're embarking in one of these projects that their jobs are threatened. And one of the things that, again, I'm lucky to work for mayors that think about this up front, but it is challenging from a communication standpoint. How do we tell our workforce what are the changing expectations and what are the plans and when's change coming? And I don't think that, let's just say that part of what I've been spending time in my career is trying to think about how we do a better job of that and how is it that we build the tools to create the types of skills that we know that are skills that will be valuable in the city 2.0 and in the work environment that will come further. And there's a number of challenges that I think are kind of affecting this dynamic within the cities. We have more partnerships than ever, thanks to MetroLab, with universities that are helping invent new ways of running cities. So we have, in Pittsburgh, we have traffic lights that manage themselves, so you never need to have a traffic engineer, or you don't have to have crews going and readjusting the traffic lights. They're talking to each other and thinking about the entire traffic system as one big robot. We have autonomous vehicles. And at the same time, we have financial constraints, and we have more environmental constraints. People want to live differently. They want to be able to, use technology to reduce their carbon footprint and do a number of these things. And I think that planning for how that impacts the workforce is something that the types of people that have my job and working closely with HR and working with the department is something that we need to have in place when we're considering these technology projects.
And Ben, just partnering with cities, trying to establish those partnerships and even just get someone other than the mayor to call you back. How does that work with an organization like MetroLab?
Sure. So I'll talk a little bit about MetroLab. We're a DC-based nonprofit that was launched out of the theory that local governments, cities and counties are facing technological change and need data and technology expertise to take advantage of those changes, and in some cases safeguard against the concerns associated with those tools. And universities are institutions that exist in communities that possess incredible intellectual and resource power, and there's a mutually beneficial relationship where local governments can partner with research institutions and think about them as, I've heard Mayor Pete describe eloquently in the past, as unique anchor institutions that offer this intellectual resource, kind of looking at what a university offers and connecting it in the best way possible. And so MetroLab is this national network of those types of partnerships. Notre Dame and South Bend were founding members. Mayor Pete was at the launch during the White House Smart Cities Initiative in 2015. Santi's been deeply involved in both roles in South Bend and the city of Pittsburgh. And so I come here really thankful for the partnership and friendship that South Bend and Notre Dame and the city of Pittsburgh have had in driving forward the vision for MetroLab. We think about our mission sort of in two layers. The first is, how do you drive forward institutionalized cross-disciplinary partnerships between local governments and universities that are poised to take advantage of the priorities and challenges facing cities and communities. And the second is, once you've created these institutionalized partnerships around the country, how do they fit together? How do they learn from each other? How do they? How can we put forward programming that connects the activities that creates synergies across the network? And so that's sort of really how we think about our work. And I'll give a couple examples of each of those different layers. The first is maybe some examples of the types of projects that we see happening across our network. And Santi mentioned a few of the projects happening in the city of Pittsburgh around distributed traffic management. UT Austin is working with their city to use video analytics to understand situations where there's danger for pedestrians or where there's high volume of vehicle crashes, and they're trying to understand both how accidents happen and also when are near misses happening, so that they can better understand their urban environment, and then how do they create interventions in the built environment, in the streets, to create safer places for drivers, for pedestrians, for cyclists, and so forth. The Boston Public School System partnered with both Northeastern University and Harvard University to develop an opportunity index, which is a single number that applies to each individual student that reflects a range of variables that, as they describe it, they bring with them in their backpack every morning. And I was interested to see that the College Board is actually now applying a similar metric to some of the schools and students in conjunction with SAT scores. And I think that there are interesting and also I think concerning or issues we should think about as we start using algorithms to offer scores and in some cases replace what might be human judgment or what might be a lack of human judgment in particular issues. Seattle is working with the University of Washington to manage the data from the various on-demand mobility service providers, the micro-mobility providers like electric scooters and bikes that I've seen around South Bend. University of Colorado is working with the city of Denver on placements of green infrastructure. So there's this whole range of interesting and compelling projects that are happening across our network. In terms of examples of programming that we do, I'll just give one example. We're working with the National Science Foundation on a project called the Civic Innovation Challenge, designing a research competition that would bring together cities and universities to address issues that we're going to be talking about today that are sort of these pressing issues at the intersection of research and policymaking. And one of the areas, in part inspired by work that South Bend has done as part of the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge that we're really interested in, is in the intersection of jobs, services, and mobility. I'll close by offering a few framing questions that I'm interested in both offering fodder for the discussion on this panel, but also for the event generally. And these are sort of shaped by some of our experiences at MetroLab, but I think also relate to what mayors are thinking about. First question is, how do government investments enable people's ability to support themselves and their families in the face of technological and economic change, whether that's transit investment, social service delivery, portability of benefits, paid leave, or the many other tools that local governments either control or could impact? How do long-term investments like workforce development, infrastructure, public facilities, and vehicle fleets, how do we make those investments in the face of very uneven and sometimes uncertain technological change and disruption? What is the role of universities within their cities in training the workforce, in driving forward R&D, and in partnering with their cities? And how do they think about that across the entire segments of population, all residents? How do they sort of apply an equity lens to those questions? As Santi had suggested, what is the moral and social obligation of local government in providing a bulwark for its employees and perhaps residents against economic and social disruption? And then finally, how can we develop processes to understand internally and communicate externally the role of artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making in government and in society? So with that, I'll turn it back to Cooper.
Excellent. And we've saved our host for last here, but Mayor Pete Buttigieg, what have you?
Those questions?
Oh, we're going to get into that. He just did my job for me. We're going to come right back to those. And I think there were a couple of things that really echo some of the statements that have already been made. But building on what the other mayors, the city staff have, and Ben and MetroLab have talked about, what has your experience been both leading the Conference of Mayors Committee, your fellow mayors around the country on automation, and then here in South Bend?
So I will try to I will try to mention a few things that are at stake here, and then hopefully we can unpack them as the panel goes. First of all, I just want to reiterate how proud South Bend and pleased South Bend is to help host and be involved in this. And this is a pretty fun reunion to have Santi, who is a key architect of what made this administration, I think, able to break a lot of new ground. Two of the most thoughtful members of the community of American mayors, and then Ben, whose colleagues and work with MetroLab, I think, has really illuminated the future of what it means to be a college town, in the sense that what you have with MetroLab is a network of city-university pairs that really navigate their relationship, not in terms of, what are you doing to my housing market and do I have to bust your parties, but how do I apply the substance of the work that's going on at your institution and use it to make the lives of our community better, and in so doing also make the people at your institution better off. So it's a great cocktail of backgrounds to bring to this discussion. Let me start by mentioning some things that we know. One thing that we know is that increasingly when we think about work, it's useful to think of it in terms of tasks rather than in terms of jobs. Or to put it another way, every job is a bundle of tasks. And the reason it's important to think that way is that most jobs are a bundle of things, some of which will change profoundly and some of which won't. The parts that are physical and repeatable are the most likely to change. The parts that can be done by a machine. But most jobs, from mayor to garbage collector, are a mix within a city workforce, and the same is true more generally. Earlier this morning, we were swearing in new firefighters, and I was thinking, knowing I'd be coming here, about what's changed and what hasn't in the life of a firefighter, right? It might sound like a very stable job that hasn't changed much at all, right? You arrive at a fire, you point water in its general direction, you hold up a hose, and that's how it works. The reality is parts of that whole process flow, what a firefighter does, are radically different now, starting with dispatch, right? Because usually when you call in the 911 center, it pre-populates. And you could actually hear a little din of this in the fire training center of a computerized voice reading out a couple locations that people were being called to. So that part has changed completely. Eventually, probably in the most dangerous scenarios, we already did some pioneering work here with drones, and eventually other kind of literal robots firefighting might be a place where that's especially logical to automate. Other parts won't change at all. The fact that you need a human being to help somebody on an EMT call, and those human parts will only grow. So that leads to a second thing we know, which is that the things that can't be done by a machine, which usually have to do with managing exceptions or managing people. Those are actually the same thing. But anytime there's a break in a pattern, right, that's where the human pattern recognition or human intuition, or if you will, human touch, is only going to become more important. And the discussion in education talks about this a lot now, right? We talk about critical thinking, we talk about social and emotional learning, and I think it's safe to suppose those are going to become more and more important. Another thing we know is that the way most workers encounter the workplace is evolving, so that if you're my age or younger, you are likely to change professions more frequently than someone in my parents' generation changed jobs. And that means that we have to rethink what it means to be in the workforce. So we need to unpack what work is, or at least what work offers to the worker. And it's especially important at a moment when our political debate, at least for as long as I've been alive, has usually talked about jobs in the economy like it's one word, jobs in the economy. Like when we talk about the economy, we really mean jobs. When we talk about jobs, what we really mean is income. And for that reason, we've probably paid more attention to protecting jobs than we have to protecting workers. But what it turns out is that income is only part of what comes from a job, and it might actually be the easiest part to replace. Much harder is the fact that jobs are the organizing principle for benefits. Something like the nature of your health insurance is exactly the sort of thing we would prefer not to change too many times over the course of our lives. So if we're going to go through 10 employers, I'd rather not have 10 networks and 10 doctors associated with that. And yet, jobs are still the organizing principle for benefits like healthcare. But perhaps even more urgently, work is a source of community, identity, and purpose. And we are, I think, now at the moment where we're seeing the limitations of well-intentioned retraining programs. And don't get me wrong, they're very important. We're proud to sponsor many of them right here in South Bend. But those can help you with the income part. They can't necessarily help you with the identity part. You've been a machinist for 12 years, and now you come into one of our programs and we tell you you're going to work in healthcare from now on. Maybe that's how you view yourself. Maybe it's not. And this is something that will affect white-collar and blue-collar workers a great deal. If we succeed, we can actually furnish alternative sources of identity, community, and purpose. Some of which, by the way, are things like community itself. So there's a lot of people in South Bend. I have trouble remembering what their day jobs are, but I know exactly where they fit in the community. Sometimes it's sort of conservative-sounding answers around faith or around family, but different structures that give us meaning as our jobs come and go. If we fail to fill that void, I believe we can expect to see an increase in very ugly answers to where people will get their sense of identity, ranging from extremism to drug use. And I think we've already seen some patterns that reflect on that. But we are problem solvers, and I think this is a solvable problem if we're willing to flex our imagination about exactly what it is we're protecting. And so I'm glad Mayor Cabalden mentioned that a future generation may be really puzzled that we're so interested in making sure there's work, when really what we care about is all of the things that we get by means of work. And if we can get them by some other means, eventually, so much the better. There's just a small matter of getting from here to there. I think I'll pause there and we can dig in on some of the guts of how we handle this in South Bend as time might allow.
Yeah, sounds good. And we'll rephrase probably some of the questions Ben threw out there. But first, I want to lean a little bit into something that a couple of your opening comments talked about, and that's the equity conversation and making sure that that the programs that you're setting up aren't exacerbating or even just holding the line on local populations that have been traditionally or historically disadvantaged, and making sure that you're trying as a community to bridge that gap, whether it's a skills gap, an income gap, an education gap. And a couple of the programs that you mentioned touch on that. It's really some of the work that cities do that most directly impacts their local workforce. And I know you, especially the mayors, you mentioned specific programs in your remarks. I wonder if you just have a couple that you can dig in on, whether it's the Home Run program in West Sacramento or 3CDC or the Over the Rhine and the minority business investment in Cincinnati. But just could you expand upon that a little bit and really provide the detail? Because I think so often we talk about cities, and like you said, that mayors are little presidents or little executives, and that's really not the case. It takes a village. But go ahead. We'll start with Mayor Cabalden first, and then we'll sort of bounce around from there.
All right, so let me first start with the supposition, because at the city level, one of the things that drives me the most crazy is this notion of there's no point in doing X unless you've done everything A through whatever the letter is, W, right? So I've got this groundbreaking initiative to deal with income inequality and affordable housing, and somebody says, well, there's no point in doing that unless you've also tackled systemic poverty and lack of access to healthcare. And the answer is no. If I can actually make some progress on affordable housing, I'm going to do that. So the holding constant, which you sort of said is that's okay. That's actually most of the time. I'm looking for opportunities to try to push everything forward, and but it's rare that all the windows open up from a single moment from any particular program. So, but in the design of our home run, which is the counterfactual to what I've been saying, which is because this was a central initiative. Essentially what happened was the state legislature had a temporary sales tax that was about to expire, and everyone in the state assumed they would put it back on the ballot to renew, because that's just what we do in California. We don't let taxes go away. Well, they didn't. And so there was a 2-week period when I realized, well, we could increase our sales tax and no one will even notice, because the state one will go away. We'll have a new one that's a quarter cent. So for free, basically, we could do something spectacular. And we don't get chances like this much. So what is that going to be? And I've had this area in my quiver for a long time. So this is my one moment in 18 years to be able to push forward with this kind of a more comprehensive initiative and account for this. So I think that some of the key elements were in design were really around the human being and the equity dimensions of where the challenges were. So preschool was really central. Preschool we insisted that we were going to fund universal preschool in the whole city, in part because wealthy families just couldn't find preschool, but we didn't need to pay for their preschool. But most low-income families were not getting access to preschool at all, or certainly not high-quality preschool that was. And so if we were going to close the word gap and other things for kids entering kindergarten, we had to focus on preschool first and foremost. And then the second piece of it I would mention is this digital badging work that we have been doing in conjunction with another dozen cities around the country, and then now I see as a central feature in the Bendable project that's emerging here in South Bend. that is really trying to account for the fact that there's a massive inequity in our system, our structure of learning in the first place. So there's a lot of learning that's happening outside of our formal institutions and our formal processes, especially now, right? That is, there's so many young people in my city that have, that they wanted to make music videos, so they've watched 17 YouTube videos about how to make a YouTube video. They produced them, they've curated, they're monitoring their metrics about how many views they're getting. There's no, and that counts for nothing. Whereas if they had enrolled as a dual enrollment course in the local community college and learned nothing at the end of that, they would have 3 units, towards their degree. And so part of the point of this digital badging work is to say there's a lot more out there. There's a lot of social capital and learning that is occurring that's not getting banked, essentially. And that disproportionately occurs in communities for which those institutions don't exist. The one badge we haven't been able to develop that is my lodestar for when we've actually achieved this system is there's these young men in the oldest part of our city that are well known in the neighborhood for being if you're a mom and you're worried about your son joining a gang, you send your son to one of those young men. They're counselors, but they also know the gang members. They're able to insulate and protect the young men that don't go into so they perform a wide array of negotiation, forecasting, social work, and counseling services. But it's not part of the Rotary Club. There's no annual contest for it. So even though these are really important and marketable skills, there's no way that they're captured. And so I think the part of the aspiration, at least, that we're engaged in this digital badging work that is very, very, very rudimentary at this point is to try to bring to life the network of social capital and learning that is already occurring in many of these communities but doesn't count.
And Mayor Cranley, anything you wanted to expand upon?
Yeah, a couple things. First, I love listening to Chris. I love the motto, just because you can't solve every problem doesn't mean you shouldn't solve some of the problems. And that is a motto I live by as well. I think the contexts are different across the country, Midwest versus, fast-growing areas. But, I think you got to stay focused on the big picture when it comes to equity. In the Midwest especially, but I believe it's true in low-income communities in all parts of the country, the real issue is not about whether the development is going to be 100% equitable or not. It's going to be, is there going to be any development at all? After 50 years of decline and job losses, the first thing you got to do is bring investment back. This is obviously an uneven conversation. I mean, when New York City, not the leadership, the mayor and the governor, but when many, many politicians said, we don't want Amazon to come to New York City, in my town, we thought they were nuts. And every city I know in the Midwest would kill for that. And I think it's a separate issue politically. It's extremely tone deaf if we allow this awful president to own being in favor of jobs and our party's against it. But first and foremost is bringing jobs, investment to your community, because what is common denominator in every neighborhood that is low income, lacks diversity because it's all a minority group with no other diversity, is lack of opportunity, lack of investment. It's certainly the case that as that development occurs, as I previously mentioned, both I don't believe it will happen if you don't deal with the social issues, many of which are race-based and prejudicial-based. If you don't tackle some of those issues, 2 things won't happen. 1, nobody will go and invest there. But 2, you won't leverage the talents and assets of those communities because they will be unwilling to bring forth their talents and opportunities into the broader culture that will benefit everyone. Atlanta is the role model for building and expanding a black middle class. And if you look at Atlanta 50 years ago and Atlanta today, everybody's richer. Not just black people, but white people are richer too in Atlanta. And so inclusive development works to bring out more talents that make the whole bigger than the sum of the parts. Intentionality, I think, is critical. Tackling deep-seated social issues. In our city, it may be black and white. Others, it may be Hispanic. And others, it may be a variety of different immigrant, whether you're treating immigrants humanely or not, et cetera. Each part of the country has a different social issue or multiple social issues to deal with. And then the intentionality of bringing the bottom up and expanding living wage opportunities. We don't control at the local level minimum wage, most of us anyway, don't control minimum wage or earned income tax credit, which are federal policies that have a dramatic impact on making sure there's at least a living wage. But what we can do is lead by example. And we lifted our living wage for all city work to $15 an hour, and anyone who does contract work with us has to pay $15 an hour. And I had a private sector janitorial service company. Actually, the CEO is a friend of mine, and we don't contract with her to do any janitorial services for the city. And she was angry with me when we did this $15 an hour law for city work. And I said, why do you care? You don't have a contract with us. You're not applying to have a contract for us. And she said, well, you're just making it harder for me to keep my workers, because a lot of my workers are going to go work for you now, and I'll have to raise the wages of my employees. And I said, well, that's kind of what we were hoping was going to happen. But let me just end where I started. You got to bring investment and jobs back to areas that have seen disinvestment, and we can debate whether gentrification is real or not real, or how to modify it or ameliorate it. But don't forget that that's a good problem to have if you're dealing with communities that have seen decades of disinvestment.
Yeah, and either in South Bend or Pittsburgh, Santi, go ahead.
Yeah.
you look like you had something to build on there.
Yeah. Well, there's 3 points that I'd want to make around equity. I think the first one is since the impact of automation is different across different job classifications, but we know that there are correlations between different job types and a number of issues of diversity. So women tend to do more clerical work at the city. When you go and do an analysis of work classifications, and we notice that both in South Bend and in Pittsburgh, men tend to do more of labor outside work. So again, I think that when we start thinking about how we bring technology and how we bring automation, we have to understand that there will be disparate impact on different work groups that is just intrinsic based on the existing biases and the existing divisions. The second piece is there's a gap that I've observed a number of times when we're doing implementations of technology. For instance, when we started digitizing the work that code enforcement was doing in South Bend, and now when you look at the trash trucks in South Bend, they're basically robots. They have robotic arms. They have a computer on board that tells them whether they have to do, what trashes have they picked up. In Pittsburgh, the snow plows are now robots. They have tablets, and they have, these complex algorithms around how they plow and whether they, whether they're dispersing too much salt or too little salt. And one of the biggest predictors around success for an employee using new technology is whether that employee had previous exposure to technology. It isn't age as much as that previous exposure that marks how successful that employee is going to be integrated into this new workspace. So you could tell which employees had iPads at home, who had a structure of they had that nephew or niece that they could go to. They never go to IT, they go to people that they know, that they feel familiar with. So I think that from a city standpoint, we have to understand that it is also a responsibility to build infrastructure and to build programs. We have recreations department in South Bend. We launched this Click Center initiative around creating through a partnership with the public libraries of enabling technology access in the neighborhoods in a way that was safe, in a way that was interesting, leveraging some stuff that West Sacramento had already tested with the LRNG platform, and thinking about how we fit into our City of Lifelong Learning work that we're doing with the Drucker Institute. And similarly in Pittsburgh, where the mayor is launching a Rec to Tech initiative. And again, the idea is like, how is it that you leverage the assets that the city have to make so that the first time that a person is interacting with a spreadsheet or that the first time that they're interacting with a tablet is not in the context of you have to learn this in 2 weeks or you're fired. And hopefully in a way that is satisfying, in a way that they feel that they're co-creating and doing things that are meaningful. And the last piece that I would say when it comes to equity, increasingly as we have more robots and more bots, because there's like non-physical robots as well that can automate stuff, I think that it becomes also interesting to think about equity between our human and our non-human workers. Should they pay payroll tax? Yeah, like people, the robots. Should they pay union fees? And like thinking unions play an incredibly important job in our cities in training and adapting skills, but if they're not getting the fees to support those programs, how are they going to maintain themselves? So I think that there's a whole new dimension of equity problems that are coming up that we'll have to think about.
Well, that just kind of reminds me, you brought up the effect of unions, and I think, Mayor Pete, you mentioned something similar, which is not taking care of the job, but taking care of the worker, and something that's kind of going in that dynamic. I'm curious if you saw the same thread, or if that's something that you've been looking at in South Bend.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of our programming, you could think of it as kind of widening circles of what we're trying to handle. So the inner circle is just income, just literally having a job. Or even within that, actually, maybe the tightest circle is succeeding in your job. So that's where something like SB Academy, which was launched kind of patterned after the Peak Academy in Denver, intended to make sure that we as a city are doing right by employees and empowering them with the skills they need to do well and to continue growing during their time with the city. If you go kind of one circle out, you have something like our Pathways program. This is with our local workforce, Work One, which is working to align people with skills that they need to work in the kind of evolving, especially but not only in manufacturing, the evolving macro economy here. And it allows us to provide some equalizing effect by lining people up with the high demand skills that they're going to need, either within their employer, outside of the city, or to be more successful in the future. I think the key there in the kind of new world we're in is to have a certain amount of humility about the endurance of the benefit there. So if we train you or help sponsor you training in a new skill, it may well be that 5 years from now you're going to need that again. So we can't have the subtext be, you fell out of relevance, there was something wrong with you, come to our program, we're going to fix you and you're good to go. It's more that it's one well you can drink from in order to be empowered to keep advancing. Beyond that, if we're trying to deal with not just your income, but a little more than that, it's really the question around benefits. And so I mentioned earlier why I think we need to decouple a lot of benefits from work, and health, I think, is a classic example. Obviously, some countries have the public sector do this, so the private sector doesn't have to. But the point is, it's not the kind of thing you would want, certainly if we were designing our benefit structures from scratch, to be associated with the workplace. There are other areas where the reverse is true. So one thing we're exploring is transportation as a benefit that we actually think ought to be more connected to your job. And the use case here is, we're in a city that's big enough to have a bus system, but not dense enough to have the kind of routes and frequency that we'd like. A lot of routes, our bus will run once an hour. It won't run after 6 p.m. or so. So if you are in shift work and the factory or distribution center you work in is on the edge of town, and you're a low-wage worker and you don't have a vehicle, you've got a problem. You probably have an unreliable cousin with an unreliable vehicle. And if they let you down more than once, you could lose your job. And so with backing from Bloomberg Philanthropies, we've been pursuing an initiative, using ourselves, by the way, as one of the guinea pigs here, as one of the employers, to basically see, okay, would employers chip in to just help you get to work, especially if we're now living in an era where it would be cheaper to put you in an Uber than it is even system-wide for you to use the bus system itself. And we're doing the math around that, trying to buy down the cost for people to get to work, on the assumption that it might actually pencil out for the employer to carry most of the load. Some public role, some employee role, but then an employer role, because the employers in our pilot program said that they found enough benefits through reduced absenteeism and turnover that they are in fact willing to chip in. So call us in a couple of years, we'll let you know how that pilot went. But the point is, we should continue adapting. Some things are actually more localized around a job than ever, besides the paycheck, and should be more connected with it. Even as other benefits related to vacation and retirement, we want to make sure that we start decoupling. I think labor's got a lot of potential to be part of the solution here if it can be organized on a more widespread basis, perhaps even an industry basis rather than individual employee contracts. And again, there are a lot of countries where this is how it works. Because the kinds of things that labor tries to make sure its workers have, both in terms of skills and apprenticeships and in terms of pay and benefits, are now running afoul of this system that we're very accustomed to, where there's some cliffs, right? There's this magic distinction between working 40 hours a week and 39 or 40 or whatever, depending on your employer. There's a magic distinction between being a 1099 contractor and an employee that is increasingly obvious that it's, for many workers, a distinction without a difference. And we need to move into a world where if you're working 20 hours a week for the city, and maybe in a seasonal job with Parks and Rec, and maybe 7 hours a week you're driving for Uber. Well, 7 divided by 40 is how much I want you to get some health, vacation, and retirement benefit out of that. Because the truth is, gigs are jobs. We just don't treat them that way. And I think there's a really interesting role that labor can play there. Mm-hmm. The other thing I want to mention that I'm very excited about is what we're doing with this initiative that was mentioned a moment ago, Bendable. As some of you may have noticed, there was a convening next door to the opening reception last night, and it was related to an effort that we're getting backing from the charitable foundations of Walmart, Google, the Drucker Institute, and other partners working with our library to create a lifelong learning platform that, if we get it right, could capture everything from a GED or a college degree to the sorts of things that Chris was just talking about, the knowledge that lives within the person who solves the problem of how to divert somebody from gang membership, and creates some way to have a sort of exchange rate between those different kinds of knowledge and skill. If we get it right, that kind of platform could be relevant to all kinds of different communities. But the holy grail here is to basically give you both a library and a kind of transcript that is as relevant for informal skills, fixing your uncle's computer, as it is for a highly technical skill set like being a trained EMT.
I wanted to just ask one specific question to Ben, and then we'll probably open it up to the audience here. But one of the things that I've noticed working in the city space is that cities are lousy with commitments. Everybody comes and wants the city to sign on so we can get 200 cities signed on, and then we've done something. But how do you, as an outside partner working with anchor institutions, how do you turn those commitments into action and into implementation and into results that you can actually see and touch and understand that you've made that difference over the course of a couple of years?
Sure. So I think, first of all, the fundamentals have to be aligned. So I think no one's going to fulfill a commitment where they don't actually have an incentive to deliver. And so I think that it's true that a lot of organizations, and there's many in Washington, D.C., and the federal government often takes this role where there's this push to see commitments. And I think that many times those can fade away over time. I think in the places where there is a real incentive to act, whether it's certain climate commitments or commitments around workforce where the city is deeply focused on those issues, I think that the commitment can provide an opportunity to put your name out there. It can give internal kind of political capital to the leaders that are trying to address those issues. At MetroLab, I think that we've seen that when we launched as part of the White House Smart Cities Initiative in 2015, maybe we experienced what the mayors experience every day, which is that people returned our phone calls when we were trying to launch this organization. Over time, that can fade if you're not delivering a community and delivering value. So I think that what we've seen is that I don't think that the cities and universities that are partners as part of our organization are doing it because they feel like they've put themselves out there and need to be beholden to a 2015 White House Smart Cities Initiative or beholden to some press release that they put out a couple years ago. I think they're doing it because there's interest, there's energy, there's a mutually interesting arrangement there. And just from what we've heard from some of the speakers today about the way that South Bend and Notre Dame think about their relationship, I think we've seen that across the country, where the idea of belonging to MetroLab helped organize the way that the relationship exists, maybe already existed, and that framework is mostly, I think, what's helpful.
Has that been sort of your experience in the city level as well, mayors? That does that resonate with you? Is that what gets you to follow through on some of these things instead of just signing it and sort of walking away?
I mean, I think mayors have a bias towards action, you know, and sometimes, you know, it's amazing what it takes to shake people out of sort of status quoism. So when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, many of us, you know, woke up and said, well, wait a minute, we're going to have to pick up the slack. Reality is that whether we were in or out of the Paris Accord, the slack was already there, and we weren't leading at the local, at least I wasn't, and most mayors I know weren't really going the extra mile to figure out what's happening. And I'll just give you one example. We consume 125 megawatts of energy a year in direct consumption, pumping water to people's homes, putting the lights on at City Hall, lighting up fire, houses. And it turns out that, you know, a huge chunk of that, about 30 megawatts, is because of the way the buildings are constructed. What we pay is more expensive than a solar energy source in real market dollars. Now, there's also a lot of energy that is cheaper by coal, which is a predominant source of energy in Ohio. But it's low-hanging fruit to the taxpayer to convert the more expensive coal energy with solar, and it's better for the taxpayer. But that project itself will take 2 to 3 years to construct and implement because it's complicated. And nobody was doing it. Even people, we had a Department of Environmental Services, they weren't figuring out how to reduce our carbon footprint, which is the biggest thing we got to do, I think, even though that was their sole purpose every day. And I think it's mayors, you know, like Pete, talking about actually figuring out a new transportation opportunity for their workers. I think it's that bias towards action that we have. We just had a press conference saying, okay, Trump's pulled out of Paris Climate Accord. What are you going to do? And the question you get from the reporter is, so what are you going to do? And that's where we got serious about thinking about how we're going to literally change our energy consumption for pumping water and turning the lights on at City Hall.
Probably why solar panel installers and wind turbine technicians are some of the fastest growing jobs right now. But
Yeah, I don't think it's not mainly about following through after the signing. It is, for me, it's choosing the signing based on what my assessment of the probability that my organization is going to be able to deliver. So, you know, at the particular moment, I have a very entrepreneurial parks director. Public Works, not as much. 2 years ago, I had a really entrepreneurial Public Works director. So before I'm signing on, I'm like, well, if I sign this and I'm sending a signal inside the organization that this matters, that you know, you'll get a little extra love during the budget and whatever, that who's going to respond to those signals that I'm sending by signing this? As opposed to I sign it and then the next day I'm spending all day wandering around City Hall saying, now we're going to do this, now you do this, now you do this. And a complex city can't run that way. So I think and once in a while it's, well, Mayor Cranley just really needs, he's got 499 signatures, he just needs a 500th. I'm not going to do anything, but it's going to give him what he needs. Right? So I don't want to make it seem like it's all science, but it is. We've had a lot of success among the community mayors in binding ourselves to these loose but sometimes profound commitments, and then learning from one another. If I could just get, because since Mayor Buttigieg mentioned the firefighters at the outset, I think it's a fascinating example because, especially in comparison to this machinist in patient care example, because a firefighter, at least in my state, they don't fight any fires. I mean, in order for us to maintain our firefighter certification for fighting fires, each year, most years now, I have to buy a building so that we can burn it down. so that they can practice putting out a fire. That's not what they do. They're principally emergency medical technicians. That's most of what they're doing. But that's not their identity. Their identity is, I'm a hero putting my life on the line. The probability of a firefighter being injured on the job is lower than a sewer worker.
Yeah.
But my whole set of identities is still rooted in the history of what my job class is, and maybe there's a lesson there around how we think about, yeah, you're still a machinist, and would you mind getting the colostomy bag? As part of that, as part of being a machinist, as we think about what the nature of identity is. The other lesson from that is firefighters have among the most powerful of the unions in municipal government. So even when there are no fires that we don't start ourselves, we can't eliminate that job. Even though the technology, not of drones and robots and artificial intelligence, but just of smoke detectors and sprinklers, has already essentially wiped away that job class. But we still have it, and it's partly because of the labor power of that union and the fortunate circumstance of having some other set of tasks in that bundle replace 95% of the work over time.
Well, I wanted to see, I understand there's a couple of microphones, and I know there's going to be questions from the audience. If there are, there's Melissa and Ed are in the back with microphones. If anybody wants to just raise their hand and put a question to the panel, we've got a woman in teal back there.
Sure. Good morning. My name's Maureen Conway with the Aspen Institute. And, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for all of your thoughts and remarks. And one of the things I think, sort of that you were bringing up early on in the future of work is it's not so much about the future of work per se, but it's sort of like the future of living standards and life for people in our communities. And one of the things I was thinking about as we think about our different strategies, a lot of our future of work conversation focuses on like income and benefits and things like that, and sort of how do you meet the basic needs to get from here to there. But I think underlying your conversation, there's also a sense of how do people have confidence about their role in society? And I guess one of the things that I haven't heard very much, and I'd be interested in your perspectives on, is how do we think about the future of sort of ownership, right? How do people not only just get income, but also build assets and wealth and have a basis to have confidence that they have some control over their life and that they can plan their future rather than just hoping a future shows up for them. And I will just plug that some of the work I've been doing recently is looking at what are the ways that we can build sort of ownership into work, right? So what are the various forms of worker ownership, how that can be a pathway to give people an opportunity to really have a stake and to feel more sense of agency and control. But I'd love your thoughts on that.
I think that's so timely. And by the way, it also ties back to equity. So if you're worried about racial gaps in income, they are nothing compared to racial gaps in asset ownership. So it's just one example of how this cashes out. I never tried this at a conference before, but since you primed it, let me do a thought experiment that I think might be relevant to think about here. So imagine a world, first of all, where as all great economic models do, the only economic activity is in making things. We won't worry about services for now. And things are made by a number of workers and a machine. And over time, the machine becomes more and more productive. So it's better and better designed until instead of 1,000 workers with this machine, you can run it with 100 workers and get just as much of the goods that the world needs. Until the machine eventually becomes like the replicator from Star Trek. You just tell it what you want and it'll make anything. And out of the entire global population, you're down to needing just one worker, and that's the person who pushes the button on the machine. And by the law of supply and demand, that worker's wage that they can command falls to below 1 cent, right? It approaches zero. And the irony is, in this thought experiment, we've created a world in which it's a world of plenty. It's a world in which everybody can have everything they need because this machine makes it for us all. And yet, if we hold to the assumption that the way you make a living is through work, it's also one in which everybody's impoverished because nobody gets a wage because nobody has a job. So in order to get out of that bind, you basically release the idea that the way we get anything is by selling our labor, right?
Selling what?
I always thought this was like a 500-year problem, that like these assumptions around how work and income, within 500 years it would break down, we'd have to think of something else. Now it feels like this problem is materializing in my lifetime. And of course, the other answer to the puzzle is who owns the machine? And if we get out of my thought experiment world, increasingly the machine is not so much physical capital, but it's intellectual property, or a combination of those things. In some cases, it's actually ownership of data, as well as the means to make value out of that data. And so some very interesting things are happening from the proposal of a digital dividend in California around data to the idea of pre-distribution that a couple interesting thinkers, Gardels and Berggruen, I don't know if you've seen their work, have put forward, that's basically about giving everybody a share of the gains from automation. So it's kind of like this baby bonds idea, but it's more directly tied to the increase in productive capacity we have. One way or the other, we've got to figure this out, like how ownership is distributed of partly intellectual capital. Now, the problem in our society is the whole way we incentivize creating intellectual capital is that you get a monopoly on it, right? You think up some great invention or algorithm, and for as long as you're alive, you get 100% of the value associated with it. But if you're driving work completely off the cliff as how people are going to survive, then you've just created a huge problem. And I think that contributes to the disparities we're seeing in inequality. And if we want to be the first human generation ever to face this level of inequality and resolve it without witnessing social and political violence, we have relatively few years to solve it. And much will depend on the willingness of the proverbial owners of the machine to enter into that new social contract that Mayor Cranley was talking about, which I believe can be done in a capitalist framework, but not without some collective agreement on how we're going to divvy up some of the gains from all of this automation so that we really do get to that world of plenty we're hoping for without a very ugly transition dynamic between here and there. I hope that wasn't too far out, but I thought if there was ever a room I spoke to that was ready for that thought experiment, it was this one.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation panel. My name's Justin. I'm a student at the Institute of Design in Chicago now, but a graduate of this university in the theology program. And I had kind of a two-part question. The first is, how do you manage political anxieties among your citizens when it comes to innovation? We know that on the federal level or on the national level, there's a lot of discourse around this anxiety surrounding change, but do you encounter that locally? And if so, how do you manage that, and how do you sort of sell your constituents on economic innovation? And secondly, I'm just curious, relatedly, how you go about reducing the risk to yourself politically by prototyping your solutions, piloting solutions, and given maybe a limited time frame, how you go about making sure that your ideas, when you put them into the world, actually work.
I can start talking about how you manage some of the anxiety. Thinking specifically how you manage the anxiety within a city workforce. So cities are interesting because even the smartest of cities also have to deal with very legacy systems. Like, I was going to call a colleague out, but I'm not. But some major cities, I mean, like, think about Baltimore has been shut down for over a month because they got hacked. And yeah, like some of it is based on deficiencies of the systems that they had. So the city of Pittsburgh is in the process of implementing its first electronic time cards, which was really innovative, like in the 80s. And we also have autonomous vehicles and drones and other stuff. So those two things live together. And there's a number of people that are payroll clerks that do the job that a computer system will be doing hopefully in a year. We haven't done a particularly good job. So the workers know that their jobs are threatened, and it's the middle managers that are lacking the leadership of saying what is going to happen. Because the answer is, oh, nothing's going to happen. Well, but the workers are like, but I just show up here and like play Sudoku until like I go home. So I think that the first piece is having clarity of communication, and the second piece is you build trust by multiple iterations. So they won't trust us the first time around, and that's fine. So I ended up meeting with all of the unions, and there's like 6 different unions in Pittsburgh, going and talking about like what were the benefits also of the technology of having less susceptibility of having a manager decide that they want to cut your pay because they don't like you, or like you didn't work a particular shift because you got 5 minutes late. Anyways, and in general, they're supportive. They have questions around risk, and they had questions around the communication. But I think that if we fail in that implementation, whatever promise we make, so first of all, make a promise, and second, keep the promise, and then repeat that. I think that that's what ends up building good like change management and good trust as you approach these things.
You know, I would just say, I don't know that I have a great answer to your question. I would say that, you know, what I notice is, and this certainly is in my lifetime as a professional, social media has exploded. You know, I didn't own a cell phone until I was running for office for the first time. So I went through high school and college, all that without any of that real technology every day at your fingertips. And the polarization you see at the national level, where people increase, you know, they passed a tax bill where they literally said we're going to purposely hurt the states that are Democrats that didn't vote for us, with reducing the municipal deduction on the income tax, which violates the historical conservative policy that local government's the best government, and that should be the first taxes you pay are to the police and fire and water and to local services, which was the premise behind doing that in the first place. The one great thing that still exists, but I think it is under attack at the local level, and we have to be a bulwark against it, is that when we have a mass shooting like we did last year, you know, we come together, we don't think about each other as Democrats and Republicans, the cops, the firefighters are heroes. We have ceremonies, we have rituals, we have civic associations, we have that great Tocqueville volunteer activism, that at the local level, we're able to break down those silos, where if you know someone, it's harder to hate them, the way you do on social media, and as we do increasingly in a big country where we're easily polarized. So I think that the most important thing we do at the local level is this power of convening and trying to bring different silos together, and we can still do that. But I do see, you know, the social media is invading us too, and trying to get us to be increasingly in camps pitted against each other, and we're, I think, a bulwark against that.
Yeah, I think we tend to say that you know, people are resistant to change, and I think more precisely though, people are their projections of their future selves, resistance to change is very high, but their actual acceptance of change and embracing of change, at least in my community, has been pretty extraordinary. So absolutely, I do not want any shared bikes or scooters on the streets. No one's going to, absolutely don't want that. Now you can't live without, they're there and you can't live without it. And there's no way there's no way I'm gonna get in a stranger's car. That's ridiculous, what a stupid idea. Okay, there's no way anybody but a millennial is gonna do that. Oh wait, but my granddaughter wants to go get ice cream and she's like, Grandma, let's get in this Uber. And you're like, okay, fine, I'll get in with you. Now I can't live without it. You know, our projection of how much change we're willing to tolerate or like is extremely, extremely conservative. And it is essential for political leadership to understand that there's no unitary, stable citizen mind over time. That, okay, if I figure out exactly what your opinion is right now on June, you know, the first week of June, that it's going to be the same in July. It's not. I'm virtually an indicator. So you've got to learn. Part of your job is to understand and to listen and to sense both opinion, but also the dynamics of what caused it. Because in part of what a city is an agreement. We all come together to do stuff that we don't want and that we don't like in order to achieve something else that we really do want and like. That's essentially what government is a compact. It's a big old Weight Watchers thing, so I'm coming together. Yes, I will write a check to pay for, you know, the tot lot. I have no children, but now I'm going to pay for the tot lot. I don't want to do that, but in the long run, a healthy community and where kids are activated and whatever is in my best interest. But in the moment of writing that, I don't want to do that. When I'm at the corner, I want to cross the street right now. There's no other car. But this thing says don't walk, right? Because I'm agreeing to do that because we're all agreeing to a set of rules that in the moment we don't want to have to do. And I feel like I shouldn't have to. But the safety and security of being able to get around my community and make sure that nobody is getting hit by a car depends on those things. So we're constantly having to make those judgments. And so if I'm just out there trying to listen, well, what are you thinking right now? What do you feel right now? And what does this change feel like to you right now? I would do nothing. And so it is essential to really listen and learn and walk in the journey and the footsteps of your constituents on the things that really matter. Like, what kind of place do you want to live in? How do you want to interact with other people? What's your aspiration? What are you feeling painful about? And not all the individual, like, okay, now we're going to roll this thing out. What do you think about that? We spend most of our public engagement time, because of state mandated rules, having public, 3-hour public hearings, should the zoning on this parcel be R17 or R14, about which people have no opinion until you ask them, and then they suddenly have an immutable opinion that R17 sounds like more than R14, and I don't like crowding, so I prefer R14, and if you vote for R17, I'm never going to vote for you again. And this is the danger of asking that question, because what that citizen really wants is they want a cafe in that same block. They want grandma to be able to live down the street. They want a set of conditions that exist only when you have sufficient apartment density. So R14 is actually the wrong choice for the stuff that they really care about. And so part of an essential part of political leadership is listening and hearing the whole person over time and all of their different all of our different bundles of expectations and need, just like when I go to Weight Watchers. And I want both the cheesecake and to be slightly healthier.
Well, I've been given the signal that we're out of time. I think it's a good place to end. That we'll all be accepting much more change than we realize right now, and we won't be able to live without it a year from now. I'd like everybody to just give a round of applause to our panelists here this morning. Thank you, and I believe I'm turning it back over to our MC.
I think that was a great panel, and I love the comment about everyone thinks that mayors should be are presidents. After I think what you've seen this morning, maybe they should be. I don't know. Just saying. Anyway, I want to thank our panelists for a great discussion, and hope you feel stimulated. We're going to have another session right after this break. We have a 10-minute, 15-minute break. Coffee's next door with food, and we'll welcome you back. And we're having a session on ethics and automation after the session and the future of work. All right, so enjoy the break.